Wise actions in Iconium. Wise actions in Iconium. There's a story that probably isn't true, but probably has played out in some similar fashion many times over the years. And it goes something like this. A young woman who comes, who wants to bring her fiancé home to meet her parents. She came from a very well-to-do family. The family had lots of wealth, lots of prestige, lots of prosperity. And the fiancé, however, came from a more humble background. Didn't seem to have two nickels to rub together often. And he was actually called to be a pastor. And so he was going to seminary to be a pastor. And so they knew what was coming down the road for him. Not a life of wealth and prestige, but probably a little less than that. And so the young woman brings him home to see her family, and after dinner, the mother tells the father, "Why don't you take this young man aside and have a little time to question him up?" And so he invites the young man back to his study after the dinner, and the father kind of confronts the young man about some of his plans with his daughter. And so he says, "So what are your plans?" To the young man. And the young man replies, "Well, I am studying to be a Bible scholar and a pastor," he replies. "A Bible scholar," the father says. "That's admirable, but what will you do to provide a nice house for my daughter to live in? Because she's accustomed to that." "Well," the young man replied, "I will study and I will let God provide for us." The father replied, "Well, how will you buy her a beautiful engagement ring that she's going to deserve?" asked the father. And the young man replied, "Well, I'm going to concentrate on my studies." He says, "I'm going to let God provide that as well." And so he continues on, and he begins to ask more questions. And he says, "What about, someday down the road you're going to have children?" He says, "How are you going to be able to provide for them?" And the young man looks back and he says, "Don't worry, sir. God will provide." And the conversation continues like this. Every question the father asked him, the young ideal seminary student insists that God will provide. And eventually the father let the young man go. And later that evening, the mother asked the father, she says, "Well, how did it go with the young man?" And the father says, "Well, there's a lot of bad news." He says, "The bad news is he has no job. He's got no plans, and he really, has no strategy for how he's going to take care of our daughter. But the good news is," he says, "he thinks I'm God." Well, unfortunately, sometimes we approach life with no plans, no strategy, and no wisdom, and we just expect somebody somewhere is going to make all this happen. And when we spiritualize this in our own Christian lives, some of us, tend to look at this idea of blind faith as really what God expects of us. And I don't want to negate in any way our need for faith, or even the need sometimes for blind faith. But there is an example in Scripture that we're going to see today that sometimes we need a plan. Sometimes there should be a strategy involved, and we need to use some wisdom. God will work everything out. God will provide for our needs. We can certainly trust Him. But while Paul, of course, he had great faith like many of the apostles, he didn't always approach his work for Christ as though I'm just going blindly in and figuring it out as I go. No, Paul had a strategy, and he used a lot of wisdom in his ministry. And sometimes when we get to thinking about what our ministry should be like, when we're supposed to be sharing the gospel, we're supposed to be living out our faith before the world around us, sometimes we think, well, we should just be, naive about it. We should just be ignorant to the fact that we are in a world that's not necessarily for Christ all the time. We are going to be with people who aren't always going to be thankful for us sharing Christ with them. We're going to be in places where that's not always going to be well received, and we can't just act like that doesn't matter. There should be wisdom in how we approach people and how we share our faith with others. And we're going to look at 3 strategies that we find that Paul and Barnabas used here in Iconium to impart some wisdom into how they were planting the seeds of the gospel there. It says here in verse 1, it says, "It came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake, that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, believed." The first thing that we see they had some wisdom in is that they had wisdom in how they were preaching, how they were presenting the gospel. Obviously, we saw the pattern already emerge at Antioch that they had just been. And the pattern was that they would go to the synagogue, they would find a group of Jews that were meeting there on the Sabbath day, and they would have an opportunity sometimes to get up and be able to share Christ from the actual scriptures that they would have been reading from in that time, with the hope that in presenting Christ, the Jews and eventually the Gentiles of the city would turn to Christ as well and become born again. And so this was the strategy, this was the action plan that they had in place when they came to Iconium. But there was more wisdom than just this strategy about how they were going to approach the city. But it also says, it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews. They went together. I think there's an important little detail that sometimes get overmissed here. Do you realize that Paul, in his missionary journeys, rarely went by himself? He always had at least one partner. Sometimes there was a company of people with him, other disciples, others that were, again, sold out to the same missionary work. We're not always told what their names always were. We know Paul went with Barnabas. There were times Paul went with Silas. Sometimes Paul and John Mark were together. We know that sometimes Luke, who is the writer of Acts, he was with Paul at certain times along the way. There was some wisdom that they decided at some point along the way to go with somebody. When you go with somebody, there's accountability. There's this sense of, hey, everybody, we know what we did. We know we did something in sharing our faith. It wasn't, hey, I said something I shouldn't, or maybe I did something I shouldn't. There was accountability with your partner. There was a sharing of the load of the ministry. You know, I don't think we really understand the magnitude of what it would be to come to a city that had never heard the gospel and have hundreds, thousands, half the city, whatever the numbers were, come to Christ. Can you imagine the enormous workload that's involved in that? They recognized that when Christ moved, when God really worked in hearts and people began to come to the faith, there was going to be a lot of work to do. People are going to have questions. People are going to need discipled. People are going to need these personal interactions that, you know what, you simply can't do as a single person. I'm often reminded of that, even here in this church. There's so many times that I make it my goal to try to get around to everybody and talk to everybody before service. And you know what? I found I can't always do it. In fact, I find more and more lately, I can't do it at all. There's just no way. I try to make myself available, but I'm only one person, right? And we do what we can, and hopefully nobody gets offended along the way. This is your disclaimer. If you're offended, come talk to me. I'm glad to talk to you. I'm not trying to snub you, but I can finally don't always get to everybody as much as I would like to. And that's just a sad fact. Sometimes whenever I have people that I need to visit, people that are ill or at home or in the hospital, I try to make it my goal to get to visit them a certain amount of times, and I don't always make my goal because I'm only one person. And I think Paul recognized that. There's a great burden. You can only do so many things and stretch yourself so thin. And so what do? You bring people along. He went together with others to help with the burden of the ministry. And that's part of the model that he was using. He didn't try to do it all alone. And I think Paul also recognized in working through these regions of the world that were generally unknown, he was unknown in, and probably a lot of loneliness, a lot of issues along the way that we don't even see in Scripture. Paul needed some companionship. There were probably times he needed encouragement. We know there were times that he was down. There were times that he needed just fellowship with other believers. I think it's one of the greatest strategies when you think of missionaries that come and they say, I'm going to go plant a church in this place that's, where Timbuktu, wherever it is, right? There's no gospel witness there, and I'm going to go there by myself and start this church. I say, great. God can do that, and God often does that. But, you would be more effective if you went with another missionary family. You and another family go out together and start a church. Because you know what? It gets awful lonely out in Timbuktu by yourself. When there's nobody responding, when there's nobody that you can talk to, no fellowship with other believers, it's just you. And you know what? A lot of times missionaries, especially even today's day and age, they found it's more effective to go out in couples, go out two families together, or have a mission compound. Sometimes you see fellowships of missionaries that go and work with the gospel wherever they've been called. And these are strategic things because they are helpful. There needs to be a witness in these places, but sometimes we can't do it alone. And by the way, isn't this the model that Jesus used when he sent out his disciples? When he called them and he told them to go, what did he say? You're going to go 2 by 2. Right? You're going to go with companionship. You're going to go together because you need each other through this time. So they had wisdom in how they were approaching this, not just in their strategy of reaching the Jews in the synagogues first, but also in going together. And then it says, part of verse 1, which we're still there, they both went together into the synagogue, and they so spake that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, believed. This is another little detail that we sometimes skip over. Whatever Paul and Barnabas said, whatever these folks said to the folks in Iconium, we know that they presented the gospel. And we know oftentimes how they presented the gospel. We see examples of that in Scripture. But the truth is, this idea behind this, they so spake. In other words, they spoke in such a manner. They spoke with a particular way of arguing their case, a particular way of convincing, a particular way of enthusiasm, whatever it may have been. The manner of speaking, not the words that they were speaking, but the manner in which they spoke was a means to convince these folks to turn to Christ. That's what this is saying. That's behind this text. Whatever they presented the gospel clearly, obviously. They presented it accurately, but they also presented it enthusiastically. They presented it in such a way that it could be very clearly understood and received and recognized that they really believe what they're saying. You ever meet somebody who really is convinced of what they're saying? And you might not believe what they're saying at all, but you believe they believe it, right? You know that they might be completely wrong, right, about whatever it is. It's football season. How many times does somebody say they know all the answers? They know who's going to win, and they've got all the reasons why they got the best quarterback or the best defense or the best whatever, best color of their uniform, whatever it is that makes them win. They know, and they can tell you for a mile long exactly why, a mile on list. And you know, hey, I don't believe they're going to win, but you believe they're going to win. And you know what? Just your enthusiasm, just the fact that you know this can often bring somebody else to your side, right? Because it's enthusiastic. I want you to believe what I believe. How often do we present the gospel that way? Or is it just you need to hear the Romans road. Let's turn to Romans 3:23 and you're a sinner. Okay, yep, okay, now you need to know the wages of sin is death. Yep, you're bound to die. Well, you know what? Is there another way we can present that truth? Don't compromise the truth. Don't change the truth. Use the Scripture. But do you really care about that person? Do you really care about their soul, their eternity? Do they look at you and believe you're really convinced in yourself of what you're saying to them? Because people can see that, right? And we can say, oh, I'm not presenting the gospel. Here it is. I've got my 3 steps. Here's it is. And we'll say the sinner's prayer and blah, da, 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 da. And you know what? It's just another rotation of the wheel. There's nothing new. There's nothing exciting. There's nothing convincing. Whatever they did, it says they so spake. They spoke in such a manner that it convinced them. And again, I don't like to use the word convince when it comes to presenting the gospel either, because, it's not our role as believers to convince other people to accept Christ. In fact, we can't. We can't convince someone to accept Christ, but we should be able to present the gospel in such a way that people realize that we are convinced of the power of Christ in our lives. And we should be able to present the scriptures in such a way that any objection or any questions or any clarity that people may need, they know that they can find those answers in the Bible or by asking us, or maybe at least we can get the answers for them if we don't know all the answers. They should know that about us, right? And they should know that we believe what it is we're sharing. Oftentimes we lack that, and therefore people aren't convinced when we share our faith. So what happens? It says they presented this, a great multitude believed. It says, but, verse 2, there's always one of those buts in some of these towns that they go to. It says, but the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. This was important because there were people here, they were trying to stir up controversy. There were the Jews that didn't believe, just like there were the Jews, remember, in Antioch that didn't believe. They were trying to stir up trouble for Paul as well. Well, the Jews here, they were stirring up controversy, and they had gotten the Gentiles involved, and we don't know exactly how they had begun to stir them up, but it says that whatever they did, they made their minds evil affected against the brethren. So maybe they made some false accusations. Maybe they assassinated their character somewhat. Well, did you know what Paul did? Do you know where he came from? Do you know these guys? We can't trust these people. They're not like us. Who knows what they may have said. I don't know exactly what happened, but whatever it was there to stir the pot. They did all they can to get people turned against Paul and Barnabas. And do you realize that all of the wisdom that Paul and Barnabas used that we just saw in verse 1, those things were helpful in countering this backlash that they were about to face. There was wisdom because now they were together. You couldn't hold an accusation against Paul because, hey, Paul had other witnesses with him that accounted for what he did, what he said. There were people there that could attest to what Paul's character was. There were people there that hey, that's not the story I heard, right? The gossip mill goes around, but then there's others that, that's not exactly how it went down. And so the wisdom helped to protect them against some of this. And so this is where we see this. And, the question comes down to when opposition comes into your witness or your ministry for Christ, it's the wisdom that you've used in the preparation that's going to help to make sure you are able to deal with those false accusations. Clear back in 1948, the evangelist Billy Graham recognized that there was going to be trouble as he presented the gospel. He realized there were going to be people that would want to take him down. There were going to be people that were not going to be thrilled with the fact that lots of people were coming to Christ through his ministry. And so he established what has become today known as the Billy Graham Rule. Some of you may have heard of this, and it was a commitment that Billy Graham decided to make, not to travel, to meet, to eat alone with another woman other than his wife. And as you may have heard recently, Mike Pence, our vice president, he used to have that rule as well. And people say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would you do those things? Well, you know what? Because it kept false accusations from occurring in his ministry. When someone said, we're going to stir up evil minds against this person, you know what? Hey, You can't do that because I haven't been able to even place myself where that accusation could be made. There's wisdom in that, right? He was wise in how he presented his ministry. Well, we need to continue. We see in verses 3 and 4, not only that they had wisdom in how they preached, they had wisdom in the what they were preaching. And verse 3, it says, "Long time, therefore, abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which gave testimony unto the word of his grace, and they granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands." So we just said the Jews were stirring up problems for Paul and Barnabas. And the very next word says, for a long time, they abode there speaking boldly. Unlike this swift reaction that occurred in Antioch, you may remember from last week, it only took them about a week for the Jews in Antioch to come against them and kick them out of town. Unlike that, we don't know how long a long time was, but they were able to stay in Iconium to be able to preach the gospel. They knew that there was discontentment. They knew that there was trouble brewing, but they recognized it was still an open door to preach the gospel. They had wisdom in understanding their situation around them to know, hey, I can still continue, even though there's opposition. In other words, there's a time when you have to run and get out of town like they did in Antioch. And there was a time in Iconium that even though there was opposition, they knew they could continue speaking the gospel. And it said that they spoke boldly. They speaking boldly in the Lord. They didn't back down. They didn't tame the message. The wisdom, sometimes we think, oh, well, wisdom always tells us we back down. Wisdom tells us, oh, we kind of repackage the message so it doesn't offend anybody. No, wisdom isn't about not offending. Wisdom is about knowing when to advance and when to, back off, because you have to be recognizing who you're speaking to and when you have an environment that's open to the gospel. That's why so much of our work requires prayer. Do we always understand the mindset of the people we're reaching? The mindset of those that we're trying to share the gospel with? No. But God does. God knows the hearts of every person. He knows who he's prepared to hear and receive that gospel message. And we need to have prayer behind our work. And that gives us wisdom, gives us an understanding of when it's time to speak boldly, when it's time to stay for a long time, and when it's time to back out like they did in Antioch. They weren't frightened away just because there was growing opposition against them, but they weren't being dumb about it either. That's the point. They were strategically presenting the gospel for as long as they could, as emphatically as they could, while there was still this window of opportunity. And God confirmed all this stuff that they were doing. It says God granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands in verse 3. God confirmed the work that they were doing with these signs. And then it says in verse 4, another but. But the multitude of the city was divided. Part held with the Jews and part with the apostles. The gospel message was spoken boldly, clearly. They were trying to make sure that the people understood clearly what Christ had done. And they found that there was division because of it. I think sometimes we are naive in thinking that we're going to be able to live for the Lord in the world around us. We're going to be able to present the gospel to people around us, and we're going to still continue to have, everybody can get along together. Jesus himself said, when you begin to preach me effectively, you're going to find division. In Luke chapter 12, this is what Jesus says, "Suppose ye that I am come to give peace on earth? I tell you, nay, but rather division. For from henceforth there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. The father shall be divided against the son against the father, the mother against the daughter, and the daughter against the mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." This is what Jesus said. It's going to, unfortunately, produce division when we preach Christ clearly. If we preach a Christ that just gets along with everybody else in the world, that gets along with every other religion and every other teaching, do you know what? We're not really preaching Christ. Because Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And you know, put it in today's vernacular, those are fighting words. Those are fighting words. Well, what do you mean he's the only way to get to God? We all have our own way, and we'll figure it out in the end. You know, that's what Jesus said. Jesus says, I'm the only way. I'm the only truth. There's no other truth apart from him. He says, I am the only way to get to God, and I am the only way you're going to find life. And when we preach a Christ that declares that, we're going to find that people are divided on that message. Not everyone's going to like to hear that truth, but yet this is what we are called to do. Sometimes we need to be willing to do divisive things when we talk about, the Lord. And it's not that we should go out looking to see who we can agitate. It's not, I know Christians that do that too. They go out just looking for a fight, looking to say, oh yeah, I'm going to get at you, and we're going to create an argument, and we're going to make a big, that's not sharing the truth in love, is it? But I think it's interesting how often we are very quick to be divisive about every other opinion that we have in life. Sports teams, you got your opinion. Oh, I'm for this. No, I'm not for that team. I'm dividing, right? We divide quickly. Politics, well, I'm for this candidate and you're for that one. We're on different sides. We're going to divide. We're very quick to do that. We're all ready to divide on all kinds of issues that we have strong opinions about. But then when it comes to Christ, well, we'll just all get along. Oh, it's okay. You don't have to, you just be a good person. Why don't you come to, just come to church. It'll be okay. We don't really, wherever your faith leads you, that's what's important. No. Where's I am the way? We should have a strong opinion about Christ. And it's going to necessarily separate what we believe from what others believe for the sake of the gospel. Well, we need to continue. Let's look at verse 5. They had wisdom in what they were preaching, and they also then had wisdom in where they preached. Verse 5, it says, when there was an assault made both of the Gentiles and also of the Jews with their rulers to use them despitefully and to stone them. So we start to read this in English, and we kind of look at this verse and we say, okay, so this angry mob came out with stones and pitchforks, and they were ready to, take care of Paul, and they assaulted them. When we think of today, you get arrested for assault and battery, right? Somebody actually has to throw a fist or create some damage on somebody else's property or their person in order to get charged with assault. But that's not the Greek word behind this. The idea behind this assault, it's more of a movement against them. It wasn't an actual fight that they had. These were people that had made formal and concrete plans to take Paul and Barnabas out. In other words, this was an assault plan, right? It was the enemies of Christ had come together. They had formalized their opposition to Paul and Barnabas. They had drawn up a plan, whether it's on paper or whatnot, but it was formalized to the extent they were ready to take action on this plan. This is what had happened. They were just on the verge of putting this plan into action, and they were about to find a reason to condemn them and find a reason to put them to death, and there was an impending execution of this at any time. And then in verse 6 it says, then they were aware of it. So they got made aware of what was going on. They were aware all along that there were people in the city not happy with them. They were aware all along there were these Jews that were stirring up the crowds and making accusations and turning people against them. But they hadn't gotten to the point yet where they knew that there was impending action about to take place. They waited until the very last second. Okay, we can't wait anymore. Now there's an action plan. It's all going to go down tomorrow, and we've got to make a decision. This is what this is being said here. They became aware of this plan, and so at this point in time, then they fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth round about. So even in the middle of their causing division and speaking boldly and not being blind or naive to what was going around them, through all of this, Paul and Barnabas had kept an ear to the ground. They were trying to still keep an idea of what was going on here because they wanted to get out before all the trouble really happened, when it really broke loose against them. They weren't afraid for the opposition. They weren't worried about the fact that people were against them. But when it became life-threatening or life-endangering to them, they said, okay, at that time, their ministry was finished in Iconium, and then they quickly moved on. They had wisdom to know when it was time to preach boldly and when it was time to move on. Some people say, well, we're just going to keep doing our thing, and I don't care how bad it gets, and I don't care what they do to me, and, I'll just be burned at the stake like John Huss in the end, and they're fine with that. And, there are times that maybe we are called to be martyrs for Christ. But wisdom says you don't always have to be a martyr. Paul and Barnabas didn't say, well, we're just going to stay at Iconium till they stone us to death because that's what God would want us to do. And he'll be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're going to end up through the fiery furnace and we'll be out, it'll be okay. They didn't have that. They didn't have that leading. They needed that wisdom to know, hey, it's time to leave. And they did. Jesus warns them to be this way as well. Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says this, behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Okay, do you realize we're sheep in the midst of wolves in the world around us? He says, be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues, and ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. There's times when we're not going to be able to avoid those types of things. But when God gives us wisdom and makes us aware, we don't have to necessarily walk into the fire voluntarily. This is what Paul and Barnabas were doing. And then it says in verse 7, they get to the next place, and there they preach the gospel. Every one of these towns that we go through, that we talk through their journey, it's, okay, we came in, we saw a lot of people come to Christ, we end up getting kicked out or fleeing for our lives, and what do we do next? Preaching the gospel again. Back at it. Back in the next town, I'm going to preach the gospel here. Their ministry wasn't finished just because people had come against them. They weren't so set on saying, we're going to make Iconium become the next, religious center for Christ. They weren't so set on that and devastated that when God moved them somewhere else, they weren't willing to go. Their mission was to preach the gospel wherever they went. And that's exactly what they did. They kept moving on, and they kept moving forward with the Lord's work. Sometimes the door is going to be closed. Sometimes your opportunity to minister is no more. And you're going to have to recognize that by God's wisdom and say, okay, I'm going to move on, but I'm not going to be discouraged by the closed door I just left. I'm going to continue to go on, and I'm going to preach the gospel where I'm moving on to. So they had some wisdom about their surroundings. They knew that there was some times when it was important to get out of Dodge. And they had to have wisdom to know that when the ministry was over, they still needed to be sharing Christ in the new place and the new opportunities that God was giving them. So, how do we use wisdom? Just to kind of wrap this up. How do we use wisdom in our walk with Christ, in our gospel witness? Many of us, we tend to go the other direction. We just want to not even have a witness, right? We aren't even as bold as Paul and Barnabas. You say, why are we even thinking about this? I don't need wisdom. I just need a little boldness. Well, that's probably true for some of us. But I think there's also some wisdom to be used in our gospel witness and in how we live our faith before others. We should have some wisdom in how we are sharing Christ with the world. We don't have to be a loner. Go out with somebody. You know what? They're going to give you some encouragement to go do the things that you need to do. Oftentimes it's helpful to be able to go out with someone else and say, hey, there's someone we need to visit. Will you come along with me and we'll go talk to this person together? You don't have to be a loner. Get that encouragement that we are supposed to have from other believers, and you'll find that will give you some extra confidence, and it will also equip you for attacks from the enemy when they come. What do we do to use wisdom in what we are doing to share Christ? We need to be ready to be bold, and we need to be ready to invest our time and our resources, but are we clear and convincing in our presentation? Do people see that there's a dividing line between the Christ I believe in and the religiosity, Christianish types things that they're saying are important? People should see that difference. We should share Christ in a way that people see that that's important to us. And finally, we should use some wisdom in where and when we share Christ. We should be aware of people that are against us and plans that are there to ruin our opportunity. And we should be aware of those windows of opportunity and when they close. That's why prayer is so important. And we need to recognize no matter how many doors may get slammed in our face, either literally or metaphorically, we need to move on, find a new place, and continue to preach Christ, because our work's not done. There's always going to be someone else who needs to hear about the Lord. So I hope those things encourage you this morning as we think about wisdom and the wisdom that Paul and Barnabas used in sharing Christ there at Iconium, because we need wisdom in sharing Christ here in central Pennsylvania.